Continuing from our previous discussion on practical ethics and social duties, we now turn our gaze inward, exploring the very foundation of consciousness itself. We're stepping into the realm of metaphysics. Think of it as the ultimate backstage pass, trying to peek behind the curtain of reality to understand what makes our conscious experiences tick. It's not just about whether things exist, but what they fundamentally are. So, metaphysics throws down the gauntlet with three big questions. First, are our thoughts, feelings, perceptions, all of it, somehow tied to a soul? Second, are they rooted in the physical world, meaning we need bodies? And third, do they point towards some kind of rational principle, maybe even God? Now, remember in psychology, we wrestled with the external world. Here we're zeroing in on the internal and the transcendent, the soul and God. How do we tackle these? Not just by sitting in armchairs, nor just by collecting data points. The plan is to start with the undeniable facts of our own consciousness and work backwards, deducing what must be true for those experiences to even be possible. It's like being a detective who starts with the crime scene and figures out who could have possibly committed it based on the necessary conditions. Okay, let's talk about the soul. What does it mean to say the soul exists? The text defines it as this non-material principle within us that's responsible for understanding our conscious states. Think of it as the software running on the hardware. Now the argument here leans on an earlier point. If the physical world is just an appearance, a shadow play, then the real stuff, the underlying reality, must be something else entirely, something we can only grasp by analogy with our own inner forces. So, asking if this connecting principle is made of stuff is kind of missing the point. Stuff by definition is extended, spread out, spirit isn't. In fact, the text suggests a radical possibility. Maybe what we perceive as solid physical matter is actually the same stuff as what we perceive as spirit, just viewed differently. But regardless of that, calling the soul spiritual simply means it's distinct from that kind of stuff, that extended, perceptible matter. Now, why believe the soul is spiritual? The text lays out four arguments, the first three really hammering home the difference between spirit and matter. First up, unity versus multiplicity. We know our consciousness, our I, is unified. It's one continuous stream, but matter? It's like a Lego set, infinitely divisible. You can break it down, smaller and smaller, never finding a fundamental, indivisible unit of matter beyond division. So, how can the unified spirit be identical to the infinitely divisible matter? Doesn't add up. Second, identity versus change. Our self persists through time, right? I am the same person thinking this thought now as I was yesterday. But my body, it's constantly changing. Cells die, new ones are born, everything regenerates over years. Sure, you might say the form stays, but Claude Bernard pointed out that explaining that stable form requires something directing it, an idea, a soul. Third, activity versus inertia. Matter is lazy, it doesn't do anything on its own. A rock won't jump, but spirit? It's active. I choose to speak, I decide to move, it's spontaneous. How can one thing be both inert and spontaneous? These contradictions scream. Spirit and matter are different kinds of things. Now, Descartes famously tried to prove the mind-body distinction too. His method was cool, he said. I can easily imagine my body not existing, maybe I'm dreaming. But, he argued, I cannot imagine myself not existing. I cannot imagine not thinking. Since he could conceive of them separately, he concluded they must be separate substances. His big rule was, if you can mentally separate two concepts, they belong to different things. This text presents a slightly different angle, though it reaches the same destination. Instead of focusing on mental separation, it focuses on inherent contradictions. The principle here is, if two types of phenomena have characteristics that directly oppose each other, like unity versus divisibility, identity versus constant change, activity versus inertia, they can't possibly belong to the same underlying substance. It's like saying, if something is both black and white, it can't be a single color. Both methods aim to show the fundamental difference. Okay, so we've got this spiritual soul. But hold on, doesn't that mean we're stuck with two separate realities, spirit and matter? That sounds messy, right? Like having two different operating systems trying to run on the same computer. Many people find dualism hard to swallow. So how does this theory dodge that bullet? By introducing the idea of continuity. Think of it like evolution, but for spirit. The idea is that spirit isn't some alien invader that suddenly appeared. It's woven into the fabric of existence, present in everything, just in varying degrees of sophistication. From the simplest organism to humans, there's a spectrum of animacy, of thought. Everything lives, everything is animated, Everything thinks, at least in a rudimentary way. It's a more integrated view, suggesting spirit and matter aren't two separate kingdoms, but perhaps different expressions of a single, continuous reality. Alright, let's switch gears and look at the counter-argument, materialism. The materialists roll out their first weapon, Occam's razor. Basically, keep it simple, stupid. Science loves simplicity. Why posit two fundamental realities, spirit and matter, when one might do? They argue that spiritualism, by introducing this second, irreducible principle, immediately puts itself in a bad position. But the spiritualist retorts, hold on. Remember the continuity idea, we're not positing two separate realities. It's one reality, seen from the outside as matter and from the inside as spirit. And the idea that matter might one day be shown to think. That's like saying, maybe rocks will start composing symphonies tomorrow. The spiritualist argues that the essential qualities of spirit, like unity and identity, are fundamentally absent in matter. If those necessary conditions aren't met, thought can't arise. It's like needing oxygen for fire. Without oxygen, no fire, no matter how much you wish for it. You can't experimentally prove a negative, especially one based on fundamental nature. Materialism's second argument is about influence. They point out obvious things. When you're sick, your mood tanks. Young people often think faster than old people. Maybe Southern Europeans are more passionate than Northerners. The point is, our psychological state seems heavily influenced by our physical state. Therefore, they conclude, the common ground must be the body. But the spiritualist pushes back. Are these examples really universal? And even if they are, doesn't the reverse happen too? Joy can make you healthy, sadness can kill you. Imagination can heal wounds. If the influence goes both ways, how does that prove the body is the master? It could just be two interacting systems. Plus, the facts fit perfectly with the idea that the body is just an instrument for the soul. Think of it like a violin. A great musician can't play beautiful music if the violin is broken. The body might be a flawed instrument sometimes, hindering the soul's performance, but that doesn't mean the soul isn't the director. This is where materialism gets really specific, pointing to the brain. They argue that by studying the brain and thought together, they see a clear link. Thought changes when the brain changes. More brain volume, more weight, more phosphorus, better thinking. Blood flow is essential. And then there's Florin's experiments. Poke out a part of the brain, lose a corresponding function like sensation. Poke it back in, the function returns. Conclusion: thought is just a secretion of the brain, localized in specific areas. But the spiritualist says, whoa, hold on. Are you confusing cause and condition? Just because you need the brain and its components like phosphorus for thought to occur, doesn't mean the brain is the cause of thought. Think of sending a telegram. You need batteries, wires, etc. for the message to get through. But are the batteries the cause of the message? No, they're just the condition. The actual cause is the sender's intention. Similarly, the brain provides the necessary conditions for thought, but it's not the source of the thought itself. So after dissecting these arguments, the text basically says, materialism hasn't really proven its case. The scientific evidence, while suggestive, doesn't amount to a knockout punch. The desire to boil everything down to just physical stuff is frankly a bit fanciful, and as we've seen, logically problematic. Imagine a world where only materiality existed. It would be utterly incomprehensible. What we call matter is just a collection of appearances, shadows on the cave wall. The real substance behind these appearances, the text argues, is something else entirely, something our senses can't directly grasp. Materialism, in its current fails to account for the full picture. Okay, so we've established the soul is likely spiritual and distinct from the body. But here comes the million-dollar question. If they're different, how do they talk to each other? How does a physical event like a blow to the head lead to a psychological one like pain? And how does a decision made in the mind lead to a physical action? This is the classic mind-body problem. People have thrown out all sorts of theories to explain this connection, some leaning heavily on metaphysics, others trying to find more naturalistic explanations rooted in physiology. Let's look at the metaphysical attempts first. Cudworth proposed a sort of middleman, a plastic mediator, half spirit, half matter, to bridge the gap. Cute idea, but it just kicks the can down the road, doesn't it? Descartes, while brilliant, actually struggled with this. He focused on how the soul interacts with animal spirits, the fluids in the body, but admitted the direct link between the thinking thing and the extended thing was a mystery he couldn't bridge. Then you have Malebranche's occasional causes. He basically said, Individual things don't act on each other. Only God acts. When you think, God causes the thought and simultaneously causes the corresponding brain activity. You're just an occasion for God to act. Leibniz had his pre-established harmony. He believed basic units of reality, monads, have no windows, meaning they can't interact directly. So how does the soul and body seem to interact? Because God set them up perfectly beforehand, like two clocks wound up once and guaranteed to always show the same time forever. Clever, but still relies on divine intervention. Now for the more physiological or naturalistic takes. Descartes himself leaned towards seeing life as a machine, the body as a clockwork automaton. But this makes explaining the mind-body link even harder. How does a machine connect to a thinking entity? Organicism tried a different route. Maybe life is just the sum of the lives of all the parts. The whole organism is just the aggregate of its organs' vitality. But Claude Bernard pointed out, the body is a whirlwind of constant change, yet there's a persistent form, a unity. Something must be organizing all this chaos, providing constancy. The Montpellier school called this the vital principle. They suggested the entire body's life could be reduced to this one principle, just like the soul's life could be reduced to a spiritual principle. Since both are principles or forces, they reasoned, they should be able to interact. Forces can push and pull each other, right? But then the text admits this still feels vague. How exactly do these two analogous but different principles push and pull each other? Some try to simplify further by saying the soul and body are actually identical. Animism, founded by Stahl, went this route, claiming the soul consciously animates the body. But this led to weird conclusions, like the soul having to consciously will every heartbeat, which undermined the theory. However, Bouyer revived animism in a more moderate way. He argued that while the soul and body aren't identical, the soul definitely does influence the body directly. Why? Look at our experience. We feel unified, not like two separate beings. We have a vital sense, we feel our organs working, we locate sensations. Hypochondriacs dissect themselves internally. Emotions physically affect our circulation. Strong moral motives can improve health. Bouyer adds a crucial nuance. This influence isn't always conscious. It's more like our unconscious self managing the body's operations, while our conscious self is busy elsewhere. So, after surveying all these theories, from Cartesian dualism to Bouyer's animism, the text concludes rather humbly. We'll make no attempt here to choose. Why? Because the question of the soul-body relationships seems fundamentally insoluble right now. Before we can even begin to answer how the life of the body relates to the life of the soul, we'd first need to solve much deeper puzzles. We'd need to figure out if all the complex phenomena of physiology can be reduced to a single underlying process, and similarly, if all the diverse phenomena of psychology can also be reduced to a single underlying process. Only then, if we had those simplified foundations, could we possibly determine if these two simplified domains might somehow be reducible to one another. It's like trying to translate two languages without knowing the grammar of either. All right, let's shift focus to another big question. Does the soul live on after death? We've established there's a spiritual soul within us, and experience tells us it's deeply linked to our bodies. But does that link mean annihilation when the body dies? Well, belief in the soul's immortality is incredibly widespread. So, what's the argument for it? The text outlines three main lines of reasoning: psychological, metaphysical, and moral. Let's start with the psychological angle. The psychological arguments basically say, look at our nature. Our desires, our intellect, our drive, they all seem to point beyond a finite lifespan. Take sensibility. We're always chasing ideals, never fully satisfied with what we get. Why this endless yearning for the infinite if we're destined to stay finite? It suggests our emotional life isn't meant to end. Then intelligence. We crave truth, build knowledge, but the more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. Death cuts off this endless quest for understanding. Our curiosity seems boundless. Finally, activity. We strive for goodness, for perfection. But a single lifetime is just too short. Our nature seems geared for infinite growth. So the argument concludes, if our nature is inherently oriented towards infinite development, we must be immortal to fulfill that potential. It's a compelling narrative, linking our inner drives to an eternal future. But wait, the text immediately throws cold water on these arguments. First, why assume there's a conflict? Maybe our aspirations are simply incompatible with our finite existence. Life isn't always fair, right? Truth and happiness don't always align. Second, this whole line of reasoning secretly assumes a benevolent, all-powerful God who wouldn't create beings with desires that can never be fully satisfied. But, do we even know that? What are God's ultimate plans for us? That's pure speculation. Third, and perhaps most humblingly, what seems like a contradiction to us might just be a limitation of our own understanding. We're like ants looking at a map of the universe. We only see tiny fragments. Maybe if we could see the whole picture, the grand design, what looks like a contradiction would make perfect sense. Our limited perspective might be fooling us. Moving on to metaphysical arguments, these feel a bit more abstract but potentially stronger. Argument 1. Death involves breaking apart, dissolving into constituent parts. Only things that can be divided can die. The soul, however, is presented as unified and irreducible. It can't be broken down. Therefore, it can't die. Argument 2 appeals to conservation principles. When a body dies, its elements aren't destroyed, they just transform. Wood burns into ash and smoke. By analogy, the text suggests a principle of conservation applies to force or substance in the psychological realm too. Our force, our soul, might transform after death, but it wouldn't be lost. It would persist in some other form. So again, the conclusion is, the soul cannot die. These metaphysical arguments are better than the psychological ones, the text concedes. They do establish that something survives death. But here's the catch. They don't prove the kind of immortality most people actually believe in. What do we usually mean by the soul's immortality? We mean personal immortality, that I, with my memories, my identity, continue to exist after my body decomposes. The metaphysical arguments, however, only guarantee an impersonal, metaphysical survival. They suggest the soul continues, yes, but maybe in a completely transformed state, animating a new body perhaps, or playing a different cosmic role. If I cease to be me, if I become something else entirely, does it really matter that I continue to exist? Can we even say it's the same self that persists through such radical change? The metaphysical case shows survival, but not necessarily the survival of the self we care about. Finally, let's consider the moral proofs. This approach starts with a premise we often take for granted. The moral law works. For any law to be effective, especially one we can potentially disobey, it needs a sanction, rewards for following it, punishments for breaking it. Think about traffic laws. They work because there are tickets and fines. Physical laws don't need sanctions because things can't disobey gravity. But moral laws, if there's no real consequence for breaking them or reward for obeying them, the law is toothless. It has no real authority over our will. So the question becomes, do the sanctions we experience in this life actually work well enough to enforce the moral law? Let's examine the sanctions we do have. First, society hands out material rewards and punishments, jail time, salaries, bonuses. But are these enough? Nope. Criminals get away with it. The truly virtuous often go unrecognized and unrewarded. Good deeds rarely get paid back materially. Then there are moral sanctions from society. Respect for the honest, contempt for the criminal. Better, but still imperfect. Sometimes jerks get praised, while the good guys remain unknown. Next, we have self-imposed sanctions. Bad habits lead to poor health. Good habits lead to good health. Sounds good, but people stay healthy despite bad habits, and sober folks get sick. Morally, we feel good about doing right, guilty about doing wrong. But conscience can be silenced, and even the best people often feel restless dissatisfaction, wondering if they could have done better. So none of these earthly sanctions, legal, social, physical, or moral, seem sufficient to guarantee perfect obedience to the moral law. So the moral argument boils down to this. The sanctions we experience here and now are clearly insufficient. Reason itself seems to demand that virtue should ultimately lead to happiness, but that doesn't always happen in this life. Could it be, then, that the ultimate harmony between good and happiness is deferred? Perhaps it happens later in an afterlife where the inconsistencies and failures of this world are resolved. We don't know the mechanics of this future sanction, how it would work, but the necessity of such a sanction to make the moral law truly effective seems undeniable. It's a powerful, if ultimately unprovable, argument for why belief in an afterlife, with appropriate rewards and punishments, feels so deeply ingrained in human morality.